So welcome back and thanks for joining in today. So we're looking at, starting the learning outcome 2 today, which is under the unit management of human resources. So last week we covered, the first learning outcome, which was to basically understand what is the purpose and objective of human resources. And in that, we broadly looked at some of the key areas in terms of, going through the bits in terms of evolution of HR as a subject, as a discipline. We looked at certain frameworks which are quite important when we look at the process of recruitment and selection. And then we looked at the modern history of HRM along with the key functions which, or key departments or functions which essentially firm up when we talk about, human resources management in general. So things like staffing, performance evaluation, looking at performance appraisals, performance management, talent acquisition, looking at recruitment and selection, training and development, and then, bits and pieces related to career progression and also employee advocacy. And then finally, looking at the aspect of compensation and benefits. So just a bit of an overview that we did with regards to understanding learning outcome 1. Now in learning outcome 2, today we are going to be going into details of what are the functions of HRM. And here we are going to be looking at covering in detail, when we talk about the functions of HRM, we're going to be looking at what are the operational functions. So we'll divide them into 3 different types. One would be operational functions, second would be strategic functions, and then we will look at what is the relationship between, so the 3 different types I would classify would be operational, which are day-to-day, then we look at strategic, and also we look at tactical. So this is basically a decision pyramid, which normally, management uses in general. And when we look at classification of people in 3 tiers of management, you normally have operational, tactical, and strategic decision-making. So even in the case of HR, if you are looking at this function in a sizable organization, which has both scale and size in terms of number of employees, say more than 200 or more than 50, then in those cases, you would generally see that the HR function would be a specialized function. So here we will look at who are involved in the operational side of day-to-day activities, who are involved in the tactical side, and who are involved in the strategic aspect of planning long-term and aligning the resources, the objectives, job descriptions, if I put it this way, very literally, with the mission and vision of the organization or the long-term objective of the organization. And in the third assessment criteria, we'll be looking at the relationship between the business strategy and what is the relationship between business strategy of the organization and human resources management strategy of the organization. So these are 3 assessment criteria that we will be looking at, going into a bit more detail with regards to specialized functions, which include recruitment and selection, training and development, employee welfare, compliance, strategy integration, planning, long-term planning, which is talent management, or looking at compensation and benefits. And then how do we look at developing resources? Because you can't go out and obviously recruit new people every time. The idea is to also focus on developing your existing resource in terms of new skills and knowledge and abilities required, and how does the learning and development L&D or training part of the human resources development comes into play. And then we look at forecasting. Sometimes companies, when they look at obviously growth and growth strategies, that is where strategic part comes in. So how does HR do their planning in terms of ensuring that they are planning for the future, in terms of ensuring that they have adequate number of resources, which is human resources, available within the organization for the purposes of, managing those targets and objectives. So learning outcome 2, all in all, would be going into a lot of detail with regards to, studying these functions that we just briefly touched in learning outcome 1 in a bit more detail. So as always, to discuss this, what we're going to be looking at is primarily focus on going into the presentation. And in the presentation, we'll cover some part of the indicative content, the assessment criteria. So let me start with, a video that I want to show. And this particular video, which I want to show, is basically talking about, the video which basically recaps or helps us recap in terms of understanding what are the key objectives of HRM within an organization. So let me just share this particular video. There we go. let's listen into this video.
Let's take it up with HR. You know what HR is, but do you know what exactly HR does? Human resource management, often shortened to HRM or HR, is the practice of recruiting, hiring, deploying, and managing an organization's employees. A company's HR department acts as a bridge between a company and its employees, facilitating a healthy relationship between employees and upper management, and it creates and implements policies to help everyone do their job. There are 4 kinds of HRM initiatives. Societal objectives aim to meet the ethical and social needs of the company, addressing issues like equal opportunity and pay. Organizational objectives strive for efficiency, including employee hiring, training, and retention. Functional objectives focus on ensuring all of HR's resources are allocated to its full potential. And finally, personal objectives seek to support the personal goals of each employee, like offering education or career development opportunities. Almost all areas of HRM have software that automates HR processes. Recruiting in particular has seen an enormous growth in software platforms and systems that match candidates with employers and then manage the rest of the hiring process. Other services offered by HRM software vendors include payroll, administration, and employee record services. Smaller companies often offer affordable, low-maintenance, cloud-based HR systems. Larger businesses, on the other hand, tend to prefer in-house HR systems, which allow for more control. Aside from the technical responsibilities, HRM reinforces office culture and helps keep employees happy. They say a company is only as good as its employees, which makes HRM an essential part of maintaining a successful business. What HR software does your company use? Let us know in the comments and be sure to give this video a like.
So as you can see, this particular bit, it just shows you the overview of what we've discussed earlier in terms of, the importance of HR. And now I'm going to show you a particular diagram, which basically is a flow chart, and it shows you the aspect of how, the whole process of HR essentially works. So there are lots of functions of HR. And when we talk about lots of functions of HR, they include things like recruitment, selection, training and development, employee welfare. We look at compliance, we look at, managing the planning side of things related to human resources. We look at forecasting and development of human resources. Now, in addition to this, we might also have union functions or union related matters which HR deals with. It could also include things like compensation and benefits, and it could also include things which typically HR would play within an organization. If the organization is big enough and the department is dealing or handling a number of employees, then in those cases you would also have the strategic part, which is looking at long-term planning of resources within the organization. So this particular flow chart actually depicts what is the HRM process, what and how does it start and where does it end in a way. So it always starts with recruitment and selection. Recruitment can be internal and external. Sometimes you see within HR and within companies, what typically tends to happen is that HR allowing job rotation, would place adverts internally, allow existing employees to change their roles. If they have been doing well in a particular role for a number of years, then it allows them to do a job rotation wherein they would advertise the job internally on an intranet or on a notice or a bulletin board. And that is where the employees would be able to apply for vacancies internally. Sometimes internal recruitment work can also take hold in the sense that referrals can be done. And for referrals, normally HR awards or rewards the employees by offering some sort of a referral bonus or a voucher. And in most companies, that tends to be the best way to recruit employees, because one, you're getting somebody who's reliant, who's been referred internally. And that means the person comes with a bit of reputation, and also, it does away with the cost required the company needs to spend for recruitment and selection. External recruitment typically tends to be through agencies, through placing adverts, to looking at, ensuring that you would need external help, which is from recruiters, agencies, bulletin boards, newspaper adverts, advertorials, things like that. And they would then start the process of, recruitment and selection. So you place an advert, you start getting inquiries, you would shortlist CVs, then shortlist further them from those CVs, people that you would, invite for an interview and selection process. At some stage, what you would do is basically make a shortlisting of it, and then select 1 or 2 candidates depending on the vacancies that you have, and then give them an appointment letter or a contract. Recruitment tends to lead to selection. Selection after that tends to include training, which could be an induction training, enrollment training, onboarding training, as we call it, different words in different organizations, but typically an onboarding training is done primarily to ensure that people then are aware of the code of conduct. Most employees are given an employee handbook. They're made aware of the policies and procedures within the organization, certain do's and don'ts that they need to be adhering with. And at the same point in time, this would also include say, for example, additional training on certain systems, processes, policies, which the employee needs to be aware of before they start, working on their day-to-day role. And then obviously training can be on-job training, sometimes called as coaching, mentoring, shadowing. It could be off-the-job training, which means sometimes you're asked to go to external seminars, attend trainings outside the organization, and they could also be part and parcel of helping you gain skills and knowledge required to perform your job on a day-to-day basis efficiently. Training after that at some stage can also lead to, can also then lead to what is called assessing the performance. This could be done in the form of performance appraisals towards the end of the year, or it could be for sales or certain departments wherein the appraisals are done quarterly, monthly. It could be monthly, quarterly, and annually. And that would be used to assess performance. Performance assessments can be done through various methods. We'll go into a bit of detailing a bit later during the course of the presentation, but they would include traditional methods like appraisal, annual appraisals. It could include 360-degree feedback. Modern appraisal methods could include balance scorecard, management by objectives, and we would get into some of these to understand them in a bit more detail. Now, along with the appraisals, what the HR does essentially is also create programs, rewards programs, in order to motivate employees to be able to do their job role effectively. So things like bonuses, annual, emoluments, or sometimes when you look at incentives and rewards are also built in, which help in the employee motivation. That means employees are motivated to complete and deliver or, achieve the tasks or goals and objectives that they've been set. Motivation can be done through the basis of compensation, which is basic salary. It could also include things which will be annual benefits or bonus or incentive structures. Sometimes in bigger organizations, senior management typically are given the option of employee stock options. That means they get shares at the end of the year if they are able to get qualitative targets, achieve things like market share, profitability, revenue targets. And these shares then can be divested over a period of time, which normally are going to be incentive driven. Then you would also have motivation through rewards and benefits, things like employee has completed 5 years in the organization has a policy of rewarding the employee with 1 month's salary, or if the employee has completed 3 years in an organization, you give them a watch or some sort of a memento, and these could be in the form of rewards, benefits. At the end of the year, sometimes you would see sales employees, people in business development, account management, normally have incentive trips. And in some cases, when you look at promotions or above the normal pay rise, then in those cases they are normally accomplished through providing recognition. That means you might be given a trophy, there might be a competition, and then the best product marketer, best salesperson, best engineer, best operations manager might be given some rewards or awards with this, which is through recognition, and that would be through that route. Compensation leading to also helping to manage labor relations or employee relations. Essentially, labor relations is a US term, and mostly we use employee relations in the European context, and that tends to be ensuring that the employees are provided safe environment to be able to work in. Various resources are provided which allow them to perform their duties well. They are efficiently working and being productive within the organization. If there are issues in this context, what tends to happen is you would see in large organizations like British Airways, BT, or you look at Tesco's and others. If employees are unhappy, they can take help or go to the unions, and in some cases, the piloting action can lead to strikes. And that would be where HR comes into play, wherein they look at continuously mapping the requirements, understanding the requirements of the employees, making sure that they are ensuring that employees are getting the relevant resources to be able to work within the organization. They are cared for, they are motivated, they are given, best possible conditions to be able to work. And in those cases, they would all be a part and parcel of maintaining employee relation. You look at welfare, health and safety, and, obviously, work-life balance. Those are bits which are covered here. And then you also look at compliance with laws. Compliance with laws would include things like the Minimum Wage Act. So, for example, if you employ somebody in the organization in the UK, you would normally ensure that people are given the minimum wage depending on where they work and what age group they fall in. You would also be looking at, say, providing and working through, certain laws which have been passed in the Parliament, things like Working Time Directive. That means people are not asked to work more than 37.5 hours during the course of the week. You would look at data protection. You would look at giving them a proper contract, terms and conditions, salary on time, and those would be bits which are related to compliance. So one particular flow chart essentially helps you understand the key functions of, I would say, HRM. Now, within these functions, before we go into detailing, there are functions which are going to be strategic. There are functions which are going to be tactical. There are functions which are going to be operational. So when we look at functions which are, related to, say, for example, compensation, for example, recognition, or say, for example, in some cases, when we look at assessing performance, but from a long-term perspective, these functions could be strategic. When we look at tactical functions, recruitment, selection could be a tactical function because it is done maybe once or twice every year, depending on the organization. If it's a call center, normally call centers or service organizations have a high amount of turnover. That means a lot of employees leave the job. So there could be a continuous activity which would typically happen. And in this case, that would become a tactical function. But when we look at operational function, things like training, things like, welfare and safety of employees, managing labor relations, this tends to be a long-term perspective. So a strategic function, rewards and benefit, done maybe on an annual basis mostly. And then trainings, they would then be classified into 3 different types. So you have strategic, you have tactical, and then you have operational. So within this 9 or 10 different functions that we look at, we are able to basically combine and categorize them across into different types of categories. Now, let's go into, looking at, just briefly from a terminology perspective, look at what are the key functions of HRM. So when we talk about different industries and obviously different sectors in which, HR, essentially looks at, for example, now in those cases, what you would generally see is that these functions would slightly vary. Now, give you an example. If I look at the engineering company, or if I look at a manufacturing company, some of these functions might be heavily skewed towards people who work within production and engineering departments, and that is where the majority of the workforce would be there. If I talk about a service organization or services sector, most of the people would be office-based, and they would be interacting with clients or customers, and that would be the service side of the function, wherein the back-end functions might be limited, things like marketing or administration, or say, for example, engineering and production might be non-existent, but in some cases you would generally see these functions to be, depending on this sector in which the organization operates. Now, but when we broadly talk about these functions would remain and rotate around recruitment, compensation, benefits, training, development, and employee relation. This is something that you will see in any organization which has 10 employees, 15 employees, up to 5,000, maybe 50,000 employees. But these functions would be the core functions that we see within most of the HR side of things. Now, when we talk about strategic functions typically tend to include the traditional functions, but with an overall objective of, looking at managing some of these things which are really from a longer term perspective. So when I talk about strategic functions of HR, the strategic functions of HR would typically include things like the HR having a people strategy. That means they have a strategy in place to be able to develop the workforce. And from this point of view, the strategic HRM would essentially have look into, for example, a framework through which they are able to hire employees, train employees, manage them, develop them, and then these employees would in turn, because they are cared for, developed, managed, effective in a professional manner, that they would be loyal to the organization, and they would then be, contributing to achieving the organizational long-term goals. Now, when we look at these aspects of strategic era HRM, what we are looking at is a lot of different organizations would have their own definitions and strategy in terms of how they manage this as an approach of developing employees, maintaining and working with them, and also ensuring that they are developed to help deliver long-term objectives. So in some cases, when you look at undertaking some of these activities, which will be looking at deploying human resources from a perspective of being a key, let's say, advantage for the organization, this would be the strategy part of it that would apply to HRM. So here, it will be a formal process, usually in larger organizations, and that would define how things would be done. Strategy, in some cases, would also be looking at how the organization develops the employees, remains fair and equitable with them, and also helps in improving their performance over a point in time so that they are able to perform well within the functions or within the responsibilities that they have. So in general, if I would say, what is the strategic function of HRM? Strategic function of HRM would be to help develop talent within the organization, retain the talent within the organization. So for example, one of the strategic functions that I would give you an example of is Tim Cook. If we look at Apple, is the CEO of Apple Corporation. Now, if he was to leave, and if he's not happy within the organization, if he was to leave, then what will also happen at some stage would be that there are key employees or other people who are close to him would also end up leaving. Now, that would be catastrophic for that organization. So the strategic function of HRM here would be to retain him, to provide things which are going to be beneficial for him in terms of maybe a compensation structure, in terms of ensuring that he's able to build a team, he's answerable to the board, but he's also given enough freedom within the organization structure, policies, systems to be able to implement ideas or bring out ideas which are going to help increase the business. So when we look at strategic side of things, this would be strategic because that is where the organization would be looking at retaining top talent within the company, because if the top talent leaves, that would be detrimental, to the overall success or the achieving of parameters for the organization. Now, when we talk about strategic objectives, if I go into a bit of detail, this table would help you understand that how can the function within the basic traditional functions of recruitment, selection, compensation, benefits, training, and development, when we look at how can that function be termed as strategic. Now, if I look at, say, for example, one of the aspects of employee involvement, how do you involve employees within the organization so that they are all singing from the same songbook? Now, if I have an understanding that we are going to do this from a management perspective, the same understanding needs to be there for all employees, and that is where if they have the same understanding, their involvement in doing the work would increase. Now, so here, if we look at this particular aspect, it means that the extent to which you are going to see a structured initiative for involvement of employees and how do they feel empowered when they are actually carrying out that function. And that would be a strategic factor of it. And give you an example here would be, say, for example, if an organization decides to, let's say, change office or move office because of reasons that they want to save costs. Now, one such decision that the management could take is they've already decided, they've looked at the location, and they would basically take the decision and say, okay, we are going to move, and there is no way that we are going to accommodate any employees if they are not happy with the move. If they're not happy with the move, they don't move, they resign, then what will happen is we'll find new employees to be able to do this. Now here, the decision is management-centric and it does not involve employees. The other thing which the employer management could do is, if they want to get employees involved and backing the decision of how and why the reason of office change is being done or relocation of the office is being done. Now, in this case, the management could actually take a structured approach by introducing or by sending out a memo that currently the offices or the premises for the offices is costing so much, or they are in a location wherein it's become a congested area, whatever reasons, but they send out an information or a feeler to the employees to say that the management is looking at relocating the office. They would then also put out surveys and questionnaires which would allow essentially people to understand why the location is being moved. So in this case, you would start to get maybe maybe get some feelers from them in terms of say suggestions or, for example, objections, and that is what management would be able to overcome, and then basically look at the process through which they are able to work with the employees to get the relocation as a move for the office becoming successful. And in terms of doing that, by involving that, by getting them on their side, would allow it to be the strategic part, because it is not a one-sided decision. Then in this case, you have involved the employees to be able to put forward their perspective, their concerns, and that is one area wherein how the aspect of HRM becomes strategic. Similarly, we look at talent management. Here, the idea is to retain the best performing people or resources within your organization. And that could also mean that sometimes you have to give them rewards, look at higher compensation, or look at giving them higher responsibility because they are performing extremely well within the organization. And that allows the organization to retain that talent. You could do succession planning. And in some cases, when we look at succession planning, that would also mean that you are planning, let's say, you are basically planning, for example, to increase responsibility or give more responsibility to the employees, and that would essentially allow the employees to stay and stay within the organization. And these are benefits that you would generally see that you are going to get from people who are involved, and when organizations involve people within the organization. So this is something which is quite important. So similarly, we can look at employee development, performance management, efficiency of HR processes, and measuring of some of the processes of HR, relating them to other business functions within the organization, which is the evaluation of even HR practices using balanced scorecard, management by objective, and 360-degree feedback, appraisals. So those are areas that typically then allow, the let's say the function of HR to become strategic within the organization. Now, if I look at one slide, what I've done is I've created one slide on some of the key functions that we generally get to see within HR. And these key functions, what I've done is I've put on a summary slide to share with you in terms of what is recruitment and selection. So effectively, when we talk about recruitment and selection, what we are looking at is being one of the key functions of human resources department within an organization. The function is quite important is because it looks into creating job analysis, job description, advertising of job vacancies, screening, shortlisting, and interviewing and assessment, and thereby lastly making a job offer or getting people onto a particular vacant position within the organization. And this process tends to be one of the core and central function of most HR related people or working roles of the HR people within the organization. Then we look at training and development. Training and development tends to be an important function because at the end of the year, when you do performance appraisals, what you're looking at finding out or discovering is that there are skills or there are areas in which employees would need development. So for example, if the organization introduces, say, Windows 11 across the board, now there would be employees who are very well versed with Windows XP, Windows 7, Windows 10, but they might not be well versed with Windows 11. So in some cases, what the organization would need to do is roll out a structured training process. And this training process would allow employees to be able to use Windows 11 more effectively, thereby becoming more productive. But there would be different levels of training that would need to be organized depending on which function or department the staff works in, and obviously it could be related to their age group as well. So some people in the senior management might not be very interested because they might feel that this will require a higher learning curve. In some cases, people in the junior management would basically look at adopting this process quickly because they feel that using a better version of the Windows would primarily allow them to let's say become more productive and more efficient. So training and development could be done for sales, for marketing, for administration, for engineering, for production, for various departments like accounts, finance, and this would be pretty much related to the fact that it is to do with increasing or helping to bridge the gap in terms of the skill sets with most customers, and that is where you would generally see this as a process being done or carried out within the organization under the pretext of training and development. Then we look at welfare. Welfare of HRM or welfare in HRM typically tends to be the key aspect wherein you're looking at basically ensuring that the employees are taken care of within the organization. That means they are provided proper resources and benefits to be able to perform their functions. And this would also involve making sure that the premises and let's say the health and safety or the premises in which the employees actually work are let's say healthy, clean, and let's put it this way, allowing the employees to work without any fear of their health and safety hazards within the organization. Now, welfare part of it would also include things which are related to the aspect of, I would say, looking at things like physical and mental well-being, which is now becoming quite important and related to the work-life balance that the organization tends to promote. And this is normally done through various HR initiatives, which would mean things like how could we make the employees more productive and more engaged as a workforce, reduce absenteeism within the organization, and help in basically developing a workforce which is going to be more productive and more willing to work on the longer term objectives of the organization. So here, communication of policies, procedures, and ensuring that the organization is having a transparent and an open channel for the purposes of discussion and providing information so that it is able to develop a supportive environment. Positive and a supportive environment within the organization would be something which will be required. So in some cases, what you look at is employee welfare becoming very important. Compliance side of things, when I look at employment law in general within the UK, what you're looking at is different examples of, I would say, things like the Employment Act. We are looking at the Employment Act, wherein you're looking at detailing into what are called the basic principles of what the organization needs to provide and adhere by in terms of compliance, which is acts and regulations introduced by the government. So these typically include things like Equality Act, Equal Opportunity Act, the Minimum Wage Act, the Overtime Pay Act, Employee Benefits and Workplace Safety, Health and Safety Act, and HASWA, as we call it in the UK, Health and Safety Act or Health and Safety Act at Workplace. These are basic compliances which HR would need to look at. And say, for example, if a company employs workers from overseas, then visa and visa-related regulations of Home Office also would need to be put into, and compliance would need to be met, and they would rotate around what is related to the compliance and law related to HRM. Now, when we talk about strategic implementation, here we are looking at HR practices being developed from a long-term perspective, which are going to be aligning with the goals and objectives of the organization, which means mission and vision of the organization. So the HR's role here would be to recruit, develop, select, retain, and train the talent within the organization in a way which allows them to retain individuals for a longer period of time, thereby looking at reviewing their job descriptions, creating job satisfaction, and overall leading to an atmosphere wherein employees feel cared for, employees feel that they are, engaged with the organization, they are motivated, and they're happy within their job roles, thereby contributing successfully to the achievement of, HR objectives or long-term organizational objectives within the organization, and that would be the strategic part of the HRM. Now, when we talk about human resources development or capital development, human resources are also considered a capital. The reason we put it is when you look at hiring employees, you're looking at hiring employees which will require a bit of compensation. So at the end of the year, for example, if you hire a sales manager, the sales manager might be hired at £30,000 annual salary. Now, this is a cost to the company. Now, if the employee does not generate enough revenues, then obviously this cost is going to be a cost to the company in terms of its P&L. So when we look at compensation and benefits, when we look at skills and competencies, when you recruit people, and then when you look at how we need to develop or help train the employee to gain skills in areas wherein they are weak, or there are areas where are gap areas, then in those cases, there is a cost the company has to spend in order to develop the employees. Let's look at the example of tourism and hospitality industry. Now, when we look at this particular sector, a lot of hotels, a lot of businesses within this sector typically tend to employ young staff. They want staff which is energetic, passionate, enthusiastic. But sometimes when they employ young staff, what they do tend to see is that the staff does not have the adequate training in place to be able to work and deliver to the standards which are required when they're taking up that role. So in some cases, what most organizations have to do is they have to train their employees continuously. Say, for example, in the back office, front office, laundry department, restaurant department, events department, and trainings are a continuous part and parcel of their particular aspect of performing well in the role. Now, the cost which the company is actually spending in training, if you look at within the hospitality and tourism sectors, an average cost per employee tends to be about £3,700 as per the tourism paper which has been published in the UK. If you look at of 2021. Now, this is a fixed cost. Now, this cost is attributed to the development of employee by providing trainings or helping to develop skills. And this cost is essentially the human capital cost in terms of developmental costs required to train employees to be able to effectively work in a particular role. And this helps in building a capable workforce, which is then more aligned with achieving the objectives of the organization. Sometimes these trainings can be classroom trainings, they can be on-job trainings, they can be trainings which are done through e-learning or online portals within the organization. They could be trainings as coaching and mentoring for senior level staff or employees. And in some cases, this could also mean job rotations. That means people who are not doing so well will be moved into a different job role wherein the HR feels that the skill set is more relevant, and that allows the employees to effectively work within that particular role. But in some cases, this is where the costs tend to be that is where the cost tends to be incurred. Now, the last part is forecasting. So when we say forecasting, what we are looking at is HR looking into the function of how they would be planning the the recruitment, selection, and the various functions on an annual basis. So this could be a 1-year planning, 2-year, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year planning, depending on the size and scale of the organization. Now, forecasting also tends to be that if the organization is on a growth path. For example, if I look at Marriott Hotels, and Marriott Hotels' long-term plan is to build maybe 200 properties in the next 10 years. Now, one of the key things in the head office the HR would also do would be to look at planning for HR. That means resource allocation in terms of human resources. And when they look at this, they would be going into things like forecasting, budgeting, and looking into the aspects of how this would affect the profit and loss structure of the organization. Because if they hire, if the new properties come up, they would need to hire employees. So there would be a planning that they need to do. And this planning in terms of when the recruitment process needs to start, how many needs to be recruited, what could be the total cost of human resources or salary, let's say, salary bill at the end of the year when the property is fully functional, how much of those employees would need to be hired initially to look and help into the development cost or the construction of the hotel. And then at a later stage, in a stepwise fashion, they would need to start hiring employees which will come up and take up different functions within the organization. So when we look at this as an aspect, this involves forecasting. And in this case, most people working in the HRM department and looking at the strategic nature of it from a long-term perspective would be doing this process of forecasting, which is keeping the senior management informed and the key stakeholders informed in terms of the future needs of the workforce and how their workforce needs to be developed, and what would be the costs that would need to be incurred in developing that workforce or hiring that workforce. And those would be the aspects of forecasting related to one of the key functions of HRM. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? Any questions in terms of what we've discussed so far? All right. Okay, now let's go into some of the assessment criteria that we want to look at with regards to the learning outcome. So when we talk about the first assessment criteria, it talks about explaining the key operational roles. Now, what is operational role? If I put it this way, in HR. Now, operational role typically tends to be, things like maintaining employee data, payroll, administration, benefits, policy development, compliance, employment law, employee onboarding, employee relations. These are tending to be what are called operational functions of HR. Now, one of the key things when we look at the operational functions of HR is recruitment and selection. And before we even start the recruitment and selection, what we look into is the role of understanding what will be the job. Say, for example, if the organization has a need today to hire a quality manager. Now, first and foremost, if this vacancy has not been present within the organization, what the HR department would need to do is create a job description, look at a job analysis, look at understanding what would be the remit of this particular role. So in such cases, they would go into job analysis and design, create a function, create the various responsibilities of this function, which will be clearly defined, and then what are the skill sets and competencies required to be able to conduct that particular function. So this bit would be, looking at the aspect of, I would say, planning side of things. And that planning side of things would essentially mean that you are looking at ensuring that the operational function side of things start to happen. So when we look at this as an aspect, what we are looking at is the operational side of functions typically tend to be related to recruitment and selection, looking at job analysis and design, looking at training and development, looking at performance management, and looking at essentially going into detailing of compensation and benefits. And these are the core functions that we get to see which are going to fall in the operational side of HR, and they would need to be discussed in this particular aspect. Now, one of the things that we look at in terms of major parts of the development in terms of theoretical aspect of it, what we do get to see is that Hewlett and Jackson as a team, they went into discussing the operational functions of HR, and they classified the operational functions of HR being employee relation, compliance with labor laws and regulation. And this is the main part of the aspect that they classified as the operational nature of the day-to-day operations or day-to-day functions which our HR manager essentially does within the organization. And when we look at how this impacts human resources and management practices in terms of turnover, productivity, and financial performance of the company, these two functions, which is employee relation and also when we look at the compliance side of things, can cost the organization heavily if they are not met or compliant, essentially with the legislation which has been, legislation which has been, put in place in most countries. So this one is what you would need to be, looking at from a point of view of a bit of theoretical aspect. Now here, when we go into the bits that we talk about, I've also drawn up a bit of a table, and that table essentially helps define some of the key operational functions, of HRM for better understanding. So here, what I would suggest is at some stage, if you do want to go into, if you do want to go into detailing and helping to understand with an example, then these are the bits that you would need to look at in terms of, this particular assessment criteria. Is that okay? Any questions on this? Okay, let's look at the second assessment criteria, which talks about, the key strategic functions. Now, when we talk about strategic functions, we need to put this bit in our mind that when we talk about strategy, if I look at strategy and the meaning of the word strategy, what we mean by that is there is a plan of action which is designed to be able to achieve a certain goal and objective in the long term. Now, this long term could be 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year for an organization, again, depending on, and depending on, say, for example, what is the size and scale of the organization. But what we are going to do is look at some of the traditional functions, but look at it from a strategic perspective. That means from a long-term perspective of how these functions contribute to the achievement of aims and objectives of the organization. And when we talk about functions like these, we're talking about workforce planning, we're talking about talent management, inclusion, and diversity. So what we have to do in this case is look at some of these functions from a point of view of, looking at understanding that they would align with long-term perspectives of the organization. Now, if I give an example here, say of workforce planning. Now, if the organization, let's take an example of UK Versity, we have, say, X number of employees within the organization, but there is a long-term plan in the organization to increase the headcount to, say, from, say, 35 to 50 people. Now, if this headcount has to be increased from 35 to 50 people, what HR would do in this case is plan for how and when this headcount would be increased. For example, we might need to add more people in sales, we might need to add more people in teaching, we might need to add more people in administration. So what they're going to do is then structure it out, plan it, and then, essentially, start, putting this plan into action. And this plan into action would depend on how the business is scaling up, how the market is, reacting to growth of online education, for example, and what are the company's key objectives when we look at long-term goals of 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year in terms of planning. So here, the HR side of things would look at not immediately putting anything into action, but look at planning to put it into action and plan for it if the need does arise, or if the need arises, then in those cases, these can be put into practice. And that would be, say, an example of strategic function, because here they would have planned for all this at some stage, and then putting it to practice would require actual plan to be put into action, and that would be implementation part of it when they get a go-ahead from the management. So this would involve, say, workforce planning. Similarly, when we look at talent management, you're looking at the process through which we are identifying individuals which have high potential, and they would be looked at for taking up senior roles within the organization. The idea so the idea here would be, for us to look at people who can essentially, be looked at from a long-term perspective of taking up senior positions, maybe increased responsibility, and then they would be adding value to helping the organization achieve its long-term objectives. Now, here again, if we look at some of the theoretical frameworks, we look at boardroom and Collin and Smith and Rothwell and Cazanas, which basically did carry out work in this particular sector. And when we look at this particular work, they looked at defining and going into details of the strategic functions of HRM, which basically looked at employee engagement, employer branding, and then metrics or analytics, which the HR also needs to do nowadays if there are more employees within the organization. So their work was majorly focused on the fact that if the organization wants to grow, an organization wants to retain employees, they would need to look at employee engagement, employee involvement, and that would be done, and they would then be required as important metrics, which primarily are strategic in the nature of helping to retain the best talent within the organization. Now, I've drawn up a bit of a table which essentially then helps you summarize what are the strategic functions of HR, and they would basically give you a bit of lighter description of how each of these functions essentially contribute to being strategic in nature. And then by taking up an example, you would be able to complete this part of the assessment criteria. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? Okay, so what we need to be also looking at now is basically the third assessment criteria, which primarily looks at discussing the relationship between the strategic and the operational side of things, which we normally do on a day-to-day basis within the HR department. So the relationship here, to discuss this, what I've done is I've taken the example of Marriott, Marriott Hotels and their business strategy in terms of their long-term perspective and objective in the company's vision and mission statement is to provide exceptional customer experiences by helping their properties, or basically equipping their properties to be able to provide this exceptional consumer experience when people book their hotels for holidays, vacations, business meetings, events, and things like that. Now, Marriott's strategy here is designed around the fact that they are looking at hiring the best possible talent. If they're not able to find the best possible talent from the market, then they will hire the talent, train it, and then over a long-term perspective, what they have realized in this particular sector is that tourism and hospitality management, the cost of training and development of employees is one of the heaviest costs which most companies and organizations incur. So here, the main goal of Marriott Hotels business strategy is to retain employees once they are hired and working well within the organization. And their commitment, the human resources department's commitment, is to ensure that they will provide the best possible benefits and remuneration to employees who are loyal to the organization, who have been trained, and essentially now they are well equipped and suited to work within these roles. Now, one of the things which Marriott also looks at from a sales perspective is to also expand its footprint in terms of the properties and partnership it has. And some part of that is done through acquisitions. Some part of it is done when they develop new properties or construct and develop new properties in locations which they feel are going to have potential for tourism and potential for them to cash in on those opportunities of tourism in certain areas. Now, in order to do that, what they do is they look at, obviously, lots of reports and strategically work with governments, locations, destination management organizations, and other key players in the sector to basically discuss and look at shortlisting some of these properties in those locations. Now, when we look at, doing this, then what we are looking at essentially is ensuring that the HR side of things is geared enough to be able to understand some of these perspectives of recruitment, selection, retaining, managing, and obviously looking at providing the benefits and employee compensation and benefits which are required. And this requires a close relationship of operational working between the operational strategy, the management of the organization, and the long-term planning which the HR needs to do in order to ensure that they are successfully able to deliver and provide and provide for these resources, which is human resources, as and when these properties are required, coming up, or essentially developed. So in relation to doing that, what Marriott does, the top management in Marriott does is they have somebody from the HR department as well, which is the chief HR officer sitting on the board. And that officer is, or that person is basically equipped with all the developments which are happening within the organization. They would include things like investments, new mergers or acquisitions which are being done, new properties which are being developed. And that person has a view into the future in terms of what the organization is essentially looking at doing in order to grow the business. And that perspective is, the role of that person is to bring that perspective into the day-to-day functions and workings of the HR department. And here there could be things like, one of the things which I'll give you an example of is there are a lot of properties and operators are currently under pressure to look at delivering on what is called sustainability objectives, things like water conservation, producing less of waste or sending less waste to landfills, looking at managing some part of their requirements in terms of, say, electricity and other natural resources from a point of view of being eco-friendly. Now, this is an objective has been built into the vision and mission of Marriott Hotels. But where does HR come in from this perspective? So what they're looking at is maybe hiring a person who understands sustainability, and that person would then be the champion of sustainability and then do trainings internally within the organization. Now, Marriott has maybe over 24,000 properties in about 119 locations across the globe. Now, this initiative from the head office would be a long-term perspective because it will align with the vision of this company, but at the same time will be strategic in nature, because at some stage, starting with the developed countries, going into developing countries, going into countries when the properties are being bought or are being developed, these initiatives will be planned and then rolled out in order to ensure that the sustainability objectives of the company are met. Now, the strategic part of this would be the person who comes in, or the department which starts to work on this and takes the responsibility, would look at long-term planning and see and put an action plan in place which will allow this process to be completed, say, in 5 years time, in 10 years time, with existing properties or with older properties or the newer properties being built. And that would contribute to seeing a closer working between strategic as well as the operational side of things working within HR. But at the same time, you would closely see this working from an aspect of the vision of the organization, which is the long-term strategy of the organization, vis-a-vis the strategy which HR would develop and start implementing to ensure that people, staff, organization, employees, suppliers, contractors, working within or with the organization, then understand the sustainability objective of the organization and then are adhering or contributing towards Marriott Hotels achieving this sustainability objective. So that is where I think you would need to look at this relationship, and using an example, you'd be able to, highlight this and cover this particular assessment criteria. Again, a table that allows you to understand what is business strategy of the company and what is the human resources management strategy of the company and how they are closely related, summarizes here from an aspect of, say, sustainability and social responsibility, which the hotel chain has in order to, bring out this particular closer relationship between strategy, company strategy, and human resources strategy or department of the organization. Any questions on this so far? Any questions, Talani, at your end? All right. Okay, so with this, we come to an end of today's session, wherein we have covered learning outcome 2. And I would suggest that, in order to understand this particular aspect of what we've covered today in terms of the learning outcome, my suggestion would be to understand and go through, a handout, which I'm going to show you. And that particular handout, would help you. It's like a bit of a detailed handout, but that particular handout would allow you to understand, the key functions of HR and the strategic nature of these HR functions and how they are related to, the organizational's long-term strategy. This particular handout is what I'm going to provide now, which is the impact of human resource management practices on turnover, productivity, and corporate financial performance, and is a good handout which you should be reading to cover, the learning outcome 2, and some of the aspects of what has been provided here has been taken into the presentation. So this would allow you to develop a deeper understanding of what we have covered in terms of learning outcome 2, which is the understanding the different functions of human resource management, both from a strategic, operational, and tactical perspectives. So I'll see you tomorrow in the next session to cover learning outcome 3. Until then, thanks for joining. And then if you have any queries or questions, feel free to ask me through the email, and I will take them up before we start the session tomorrow. Is that okay? Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. You too. Have a good day. Bye. Bye for now.